Good evening and a warm welcome on behalf of the Jewish Historical Society of England Leeds branch and on behalf of MILIM to this evening's presentation. Our online series of talks and conversations continues with our guest, Dr. Anne Kershen, and I'll introduce Anne in just a moment. Welcome wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you are in the world. A particular welcome to our viewers in Canada, in Israel, and the United States of America. Please do ask questions. You can ask a question at any time you like by using the Q&A facility on your screen and typing in whatever you'd like to ask. As always, we'll try to get through as many of your questions as possible. Please also be aware of the chat facility, which allows you to send a message or a comment to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. Finally, this event is being recorded and will be posted on the MILIM website at milim.org.uk in the next few days. Recordings of most of our prior events are there, as well as details about our upcoming programme and a facility to book tickets for our events. And so to our speaker this evening. Dr. Anne Kershen is an Honorary Senior Research Fellow in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the Queen Mary University of London. Formerly an executive at a London public relations company and spent a year as the curator of the London Museum of Jewish Life before entering the academic world as a mature student whilst her family were growing up. She took over the Barnett Shine Senior Research Fellowship in 1990 and remained the fellow until she retired to take up her position at Queen Mary University in 2011. And established the Centre for the Study of Migration and was its director until her retirement. She remains a media consultant on migration and appeared in the BBC series The Victorian Slum, and has published several books about her work. This evening, she will be speaking about the rise, fall, and rise again of the Jewish tailors' trade unions in Leeds. And we are all fascinated to hear what you have to say. So over to you. We'll be back to you later.
Thanks, Jonathan. I assume that you can all see me. I can just see a little square me. So I'm talking to you all from all over the world and particularly from people in Leeds. And I actually know that this talk was postponed from just before lockdown. So it's slightly delayed. So I can't be with you personally, but good evening. I called this talk Politics or Pragmatism, because one has to think about the Jewish trade unions, and I'm going to explain how I came to them, to think about them in the context of whether the Jewish workers were actually politically inspired or joined together to protect themselves from their employers. Now, I began the research, and as Jonathan explained, I actually was a mature student, having been a teenage bride, so I came to it all much later in life. I did my first degree and was quite interested because I wanted to look at the way in which Eastern European refugees influenced the British trade union movement. And after a very short while, because some of you may know when you do a thesis, you have to do research before you put in your proposal, I realized that there was no influence, because while trade unions had been active in Britain from, well, new model unions from the 1870s, trade unions in Eastern Europe were in the embryonic state until the 1880s and 1890s. So it was actually the other way around. It was English or British socialists who influenced Jewish workers, because I'm going to focus on Jewish workers. And I'm actually going to start now at the end of my story, because in July 1915, the United Garment Workers Trade Union was founded. The main union was the Amalgamated Union of Clothing Workers, which had originated in Leeds and had 12,000 members. And very impressively, the second largest was the Amalgamated Jewish Tailors, Machiners and Pressers Union, which was based in Leeds, and it had 4,500 members. And the secretary of the new national union was one Moses Sclair, he was appointed financial secretary. Now, some of you may recognize that name, and I will say that at the end of my talk, I'm going to put up a PowerPoint which will give you the names of the actors, the dates of the strikes, the significant instances, and just 2 images that I've managed to get, which some of you may not have seen. So this new clothes trade union was small by comparison to, say, the National Union of Railway Workers, which was of 180,000. But what it showed, which I think was very significant, was that immigrant Jews, and the Leeds Jewish Union was predominantly immigrant Jews, Gentile women and male factory workers could combine into one of what they called the new unions, the unions of unskilled workers. And I think that's something that Leeds people should be proud of. London lagged behind, I have to tell you. So now let me give you some background as to why Leeds emerged as such an important tailoring centre. And by the way, this predates Montague Burton's factory. I'm not going to talk about that. That doesn't come in to my story, actually. Now, some of you, probably Leeds people, know this as well as I do, that by the 1920s, there was a range of Jewish craftsmen and professionals and a small Jewish community already established in Leeds. It had become an ideal centre for manufacture and distribution. It had the canals and it had the railway links. So it was viewed actually with tremendous potential for anyone who wanted to develop an industry and a business. And in 1842, there were actually 200 factories in Leeds. Now, one of the immigrants that I'm going to talk about, and I'm sure you've heard of him, was from Surrey, actually. So he not very far from where I'm speaking to you this evening. It was a guy named John Barron, and he opened a tailor's shop. And in 1856, he opened his factory in Albert Street. And another immigrant, a German immigrant called Herman Friend, had a tailoring workshop close by in Templar Street, in which he employed 8 workers. I was just explaining to Jonathan and Stuart before we started that some of you may have seen, those Leeds people, the programme of Very British History. And one of the areas that they looked at, it was all about immigrants actually, was Leeds and the Leeds Jewish community. And I participated in that programme, and I came up to Leeds to film. I have to say, partly in the market, which I thought is wonderful, and partly in a derelict factory workshop crawling with rats, but that's another story. And I got a feeling that we looked for the Templar Street particularly, and it had gone, but you might be able to clarify that with me. Now, Barron was a very active and ambitious man. And he was beginning to produce, we're talking about the middle of the 19th century, when you have the emergence of a class of people who are interested in having new, not secondhand clothes. They're an emerging middle class, lower middle class and upper working class. And Barron recognized that he could speed up production by actually inventing the band knife. Again, some of you may have heard this. And he was inspired by the band saw. And he actually saw the means by which he could cut out multi-layers of material and manufacture at a much faster rate. But he also recognized that suits, jackets were too heavy for a lot of the women. There were a lot of women working in his factory. And he actually approached Herman Friend to suggest that would Herman Friend be interested in his workshop setting up a system of subdivision, the making through of a process of a jacket, but not all in one. You would have a machiner, a presser, an underpresser, and a tailor. And the tailor in those workshops was not the skilled tailor we recognize today. He wanted someone that he could give out the cut jackets to. They would put them together, send them back to the factory, put them together with the trousers, and Barron could accelerate and expand his manufacture. Now, the system of subdivision was not invented by Jewish immigrants. It had been in existence for quite a long time in England. And what was interesting was that initially Barron approached some rather skilled tailors in Leeds and asked them if they would take up the subdivisional manufacture for him and go into business with him. And they refused because it would demean their position as skilled tailors. And that's why he actually approached Friend and asked him if he could use his workshop. And in Friend's workshop, he employed, and I'm going to mention three names with which you may be familiar because they emerged as eventually themselves manufacturers: David Lubelski, Jacob Fraze, and Solomon Kamrash. So they're three names some of you may recognize. And I actually traced Lubelski because he features in my story quite a lot. And in fact, when I read his obituary in the newspaper library in Colindale, I actually sat there and cried because I'd become very fond of him. He was a man I respected, and I think you'll realize why when I go on. And then in 1866, an immigrant called Moishe Goodman settled in Leeds. There was beginning to be a grapevine of knowledge. You know, the Eastern European Jewish community had a grapevine that operated between, if you like, the Pale of Settlement and also London and Leeds and Manchester. And Moishe Goodman had come from Kovno, and he recognized that at this time, we're talking about the middle to late 1860s, there was a need for more workers. There was a need to recruit tailors. And he made it his business several times. He went back to Kovno and Warsaw to recruit young men to come to Leeds and actually learn, and that was the skill of subdivisional, because you got learners who you then let them graduate to a level where they were skilled. And then in a lot of the workshops in London and Leeds, you got rid of them because they'd be asking for too much money. Now, at this time, life in the Pale of Settlement was increasingly hard. Jews had been forced into the towns. A lot of them were now living in cellars. And therefore, the idea of actually migrating where there were job opportunities in the late 60s and early 1870s was very appealing. And another point, which some of you may realize and some of you may not be familiar with, is that in Eastern Europe, in the shtetls, if you like, in the Jewish villages, tailors weren't the respected craftsmen. The people that were respected, if your daughter was going to marry someone, it was a rabbi or someone learned in Jewish affairs and Jewish studies. A tailor was really, you know, not someone you wanted your daughter to marry, even if he could possibly earn a living. So there was the incentive for particularly young men to migrate from Eastern Europe in that great movement west that we see in the late 1870s and 1880s and move to Leeds. And some of these immigrants arrived in Goole to travel to Leeds, and they just had one word written on a piece of paper. They spoke no English, they read no English probably, and that word was Leeds. And by 1881, there were 1,588 Jewish tailors in Leeds, and by 1911, there were 7,000. And the number of workshops grew, and with it grew the sweating system. And the definition of sweating workers was workers who were worked the longest hours in the worst conditions for the poorest wages. And the workers were desperate because they did not earn well, and they drank and they gambled, and they were driven to it out of desperation. And there was a Jewish writer at the time called Winchevsky, and he apologized. He said, you can forgive the worker for drinking and gambling when he hears his children crying out, "Father, give me bread." Now, the quote comes from a Yiddish paper, which I had to learn Yiddish to be able to read it and translate it. And I found this very moving because it was at a time generally where there was little sympathy for the poor. People believed that they were poor because they were idle or because they drank. But gradually, as we get later in that century, towards the end of the 19th century, the realization came that people drank because they were poor. They drank, if you like, because they were miserable. And both Jewish workers and non-Jewish workers would go to the pub where they would find warmth and companionship. And very often, and this comes into play in the context of the formation of trade unions, they would interact each with the other. Now in Leeds, there were multiplicity of size workshops, and Leeds had quite large workshops. A tailoring workshop could have 40 people working in it, much larger than in London. And there was a report in the Yiddish press by Joseph Finn, who I will talk to you about more later. And he wrote, "There are many Jewish workers in Leeds. Almost all of them belong to the tailoring trade." And then he said, tailors who work with needle and thread. Templar Street in Leeds is a ghetto, as existed in the old days in Rome, Prague, and Frankfurt on Marne. And the Leylands were predominantly inhabited by the Jewish population. As the Irish had moved out, the Jewish population had moved in. And in 1892, out of 1,300 homes in the Leylands, 1,900 were lived in by Jews. And the community, both the old established community and the newly arrived community, founded their own synagogues. There were the Englishes and the Grinners. The Grinners were the new arrivals. And Belgrave Street Synagogue, which again, people in Leeds will be much more familiar with than I am, was the Englishes Synagogue. The Greeners Synagogue was in St. Albans Street. And very briefly, there was a Reform community which lasted about a year. And then there wasn't a Reform Jewish community founded until 1944. So you had the separation, not on quite the scale that you found in London, because you had the sort of Anglo-Jewish aristocracy, if I might call them, but there was a separation between the Englishes and the Grinners. And by 1881, there were 21 wholesale clothiers in Leeds. By 1891, there were 145 wholesale clothiers in Leeds. So with that expansion was the expansion of the Jewish workshops, because they all worked on this subdivisional system. And I called it a system of separation yet interaction, because the English wholesale clothiers were dependent on the Jewish subcontractors, although they did have women working in the factories and they had some men as well. Now, in 1880, there was a House of Lords Select Committee on the sweating system. It was initiated by the shock of the conditions in London, and that actually came to the fore because what was happening in London was that clothes were being manufactured in the East End, and very often the workers in the workshops, not going home, would sleep in the clothes they were making. And some of them might have had smallpox, and that was being imported into the West End by the people who were actually wearing the clothes. And there were reports earlier in 1884 of the appalling conditions to be found in the workshops. And a Lancet report of 1888 actually reported on the revolting state of the water closets. And I always found it quite interesting, and again, some of you may know this, that to put a fine glaze on the cloth, they would use urine. Not quite sure how it was collected, but we won't go into that either this evening. David Lubelski, by this time, had become a wholesale clothier and a senior master, and he confirmed that the workers lived and worked in wretched conditions. Now, when it was discovered that there was actually there were bad conditions in Leeds and evidence of smallpox, it was decided to extend the House of Lords Sweating Commission to cover Leeds. And someone who gave evidence to that sweating commission was James Sweeney, who was a founder of the Socialist League, which I'm going to come to when I talk about trade unions. And he was also, he was not Jewish, but he was one-time secretary of the Leeds Jewish Tailors Society. Payment for the tailors was by piece or day work. Piece work was again exploitative, because the workers would be forced to produce as much as they could in the shortest time so that they could get their wages. There was no set wage. You got paid for what you made. Day payment would be, you'd be paid by the day, irrespective of what you produced. Piecework was an evil system of paying people, and it took some time to eradicate it. And in spite of the exploitation by the masters, Joseph Finn, and as I say, he was an immigrant tailor's machiner, and he was a founder member of the Leeds branch of the Socialist League, which I'll come to, said that the workers tolerated the exploitation and, to quote his words, would bend down for the masters to sit on them rather than join trade unions. Not quite accurate. Right, so that's a little bit of the background in which we find the tailors. Subdivisional tailors, few of them spoke English. This was another thing that was reported on. Few of them spoke English or could write English. They'd come as immigrants and they were being exploited. And I remember when I did that program about Leeds and the Jewish community of Leeds, the young man who was the sort of main core of the program asked me when I was being interviewed, well, of course, who exploited these Jewish tailoring workers? And I said, Jewish masters. Their belief was that they'd been exploited so they could exploit others. So the situation was that the Jewish workers were exploited by Jewish masters. Now we'll get on to trade unions. In 1876, which is at a time when trade unions we called them the new model unions because they were meant to be peaceful, law-abiding, but setting out to improve the lives and working conditions and wages of the workers. In 1876, a Jewish working tailors society was founded, arguably born out of self-defense. The workers were enduring an 18-hour working day in the busy. The busy was the time, the tailoring trade was divided up into the busy and the slack. And the busy was usually from about March to June, and then again from about September through till maybe the end of November. The slack, so the workers had to do all their work in the busy because in the slack there was very little work. So in the busy, the workers were enduring an 18-hour working day and reportedly enduring physical attacks by the employers. The trade union was founded in 1876, had 40 to 50 members, which is not a lot. But what's significant was that my research showed up it was one of only 3 registered unions in Leeds. The others were the pattern makers and tanners. So you had one Jewish working tailors trade society and the other 2 were English. And it's possible that because they were located in close proximity, there might have been some influence from the English unions. They managed to persuade the employers to shorten the working day, but the union came to an end because, quite amusingly, the members became upwardly mobile and they changed their name to a sick and burial society for the strictly Orthodox in 1880. And then they affiliated to the Ancient Order of Foresters. So they actually became a friendly society and they shed the image of this working tailor society and arguably also the name Strictly Orthodox. That went too, as if you like, the upwardly mobile integrating move example of what was happening to those early tailors. Now in 1883, and I'm going to show at the end quickly a PowerPoint which will give you the dates and the names of the unions and the players in my story tonight. The Jewish Working Tailors Society was resurrected and membership was 2p a week. I've been trying to work out what the equivalent would be. bearing in mind that the poverty line at this time was around about an earning of £1 a week. And I think that was maybe a shilling. Maybe some of you are cleverer than myself. £100 was equal, in those days, was equal to 12,000 today. Any mathematicians, good luck. Now, again, what exemplifies the future of the trade union movement was that in 1884, the machiners and pressers founded separate unions. So you then had a tailors' union, a machiners' union, and a pressers' union. Now, the machiner, if you like, was the most skilled. The presser was next in the hierarchy because with his skill, with his iron, which could often weigh up to 20 pounds, if any of you have seen them, very, very heavy irons. And they could actually iron the shape and improve the shape of the garment. And the tailor, I say, was the general tailor who would do the sewing up, not the styling. And then you had the poor underpresser. And the underpresser was the poor guy who had to get up and light the ovens in which the irons were heated. And he would be subcontracted by the pressers. So within the workshops, you also had subcontraction. So it was a very iniquitous system, and a system actually that thrived on the desperation and necessity, as Winchevsky said, of fathers who had to feed their children. Now, in 1884, a man called Joseph Finn arrives on the scene. He was a founder member of the Leeds branch of the Socialist League, which was a breakaway from the Social Democratic Federation. The Socialist League, if you like, was slightly more left-wing. The Social Democratic Federation was also looking to improve the lot of the working man by peaceful means. The Socialist League, one of its members you may have heard of, maybe in the context of his wallpaper, was William Morris. And Finn arrives in Leeds on the scene in 1884, and with James Sweeney, he sets out to actually influence the tailoring workers. Now, Finn was bilingual, he was educated, he spoke Yiddish, he spoke and wrote English, and he provided the bridge between the socialists and the tailors. And in 1884, the tailors went on strike, the Jewish tailors went on strike. Now, Finn said it was the first Jewish strike by the first Jewish trade union in the modern world. I'm not quite sure how accurate that was. It certainly wasn't the first Jewish trade union. It might have been the first trade union strike. But sadly, the strike failed. Why did it fail? Because they picked November. And that was the end of the busy, and the employers weren't particularly worried because they didn't have much work for the tailors. So why worry? You know, we're not going to give in to them. In May 1885, there was another strike with the help and guidance of James Sweeney, who at one time became secretary actually of one of the Jewish unions. So the interaction between Jew and non-Jew was quite impressive. In the fight for better conditions, if you like, religion played a very small part in terms of separation. Now, this time, May is a really good time to have a tailoring strike because you're coming up to the season. You've got Ascot, you've got all the activities and the summer parades, and you need to manufacture the garments. And blacklegs were actually sent from London. The employers got blacklegs to come to London. But quite interestingly, Sweeney and Finn met the blacklegs, gave them return tickets to London, and they went back. And the strikers were successful. But sadly, as ever, victory was short-lived because one of the things you need if you go on strike is a strike fund. And if you don't have a strike fund, it's all very well fighting for better conditions and better money, but you need to have money to survive during the strike. And there wasn't a strike fund, and it was short-lived, and the workers gradually returned to work. And Joseph Finn left for America. He eventually came back, but he returned to London and became secretary of the United Ladies Tailors Trade Union. He then has another role, which I'll turn away slightly from trade unions because I think it's quite important. And some of you may be aware that the period in which I'm talking showed increasing influx of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. And with the increasing arrival and presence was concern about the alien. Now, you hear a lot at this time about the alien, these aliens coming in. The alien, if you like, maybe even not a euphemism, but it was, you didn't hear people talking about them Eastern European Jews, they were aliens. And what you'll get in 1905 is the first Immigration Act, which was called the Aliens Act, which was predominantly to impose controls on Jews coming in from Eastern Europe. And the trade union movement, the Trade Union Congress, every year held a resolution, put forward a resolution to stop the entry of pauper aliens. And Joseph Finn actually wrote a very moving pamphlet called A Voice from the Alien, which actually put forward the case that the Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe were not actually in any way endangering the British economy or British life. They were actually contributing to it. I could go on about my feelings about Brexit, but you might cut me off now, Jonathan, so I'll shut up. Now, in 1888, there were 3 Jewish tailoring trade unions in Leeds: tailors, machiners, and pressers. And they were guided by the socialist leaguers, James Sweeney, Tom Paler, and Tom Maguire. Tom Maguire, some of you may have heard of. I'm not going to read it now. He wrote a most moving poem about the life of the sweated worker. And it really is very moving. And if anybody wants to read it, it's probably online. And I didn't give details of my book, but it's also in my book that I wrote about the tailoring trade. In 1888, the Jewish tailors, machiners, and pressers went on strike and caused employers once again to draw on non-union labour from London and provincial cities who would actually accept longer hours and lower pay. On the 5th of May, 1888, 3,000 Leeds Jewish tailors went on strike, demanding a 58-hour working week and overtime payment at 1.5. Not surprisingly, this was refused. Sweeney, Maguire, and Paler spoke at a meeting in Victoria Square, attended by 5,000 people. And David Lubelski, who at that time was an employer, not a worker, spoke in support. And even some of the wholesalers supported the strike, but the masters stuck out. The strike eventually failed again because of lack of funds, and gradually the men went back to work. Now, 1888 is a significant year because it's the year of the Match Girls strike. 1889 is the year of the London Dockers strike and gas workers strike. And in 1889, the Gas Workers and General Labourers Union is founded. But sadly, what is evident is that socialist ideology was all very well, but it didn't put food on the tables. Now, for some Jewish tailors, socialism and the concept of socialist trade unions were analogous with atheism, and they wouldn't support it. And attempts were made to start up new unions, and eventually the Jewish tailors, machiners, and pressers re-established unions in Leeds, and then joined the recently formed Leeds branch of the Gas Workers and General Labourers Union. It was a short marriage. At one time, it had 2,000 members and 50% of the Leeds Jewish tailoring workforce, but it didn't last because the Jewish workers took liberties. One of them asked for 200 pickets to support him because his employer, his master, wouldn't give him enough money to go gambling. And gradually, the Jewish members of the Gas Workers and Labourers Union left, And by 1892, out of that large number, only 12 Jewish members were left. But it wasn't only the Jewish members that were leaving. The local branches of the union were suffering. There was a rise in unemployment and thus a fall in membership. Because between 1888 and 1892, there'd actually been a resurgence in the economy. And when there's a resurgence in the economy, you want a workforce. By 1892, the economy was once again in recession, so there wasn't the need to keep your workers. So if they went on strike, you actually let them go. There was a short-lived independent anarchist Jewish tailors union in Leeds, and it failed, although some elements of anarchism survived. In 1893, the Amalgamated Jewish Tailors, Machiners and Pressers Union was founded with initial membership of just 10. But it survived, taking on the best of both the new and the new model varieties of trade unionism. And if you remember, it was one of the major components of the national union that was formed in 1815. And 1893 to 1915 were years of economic recession and progression. The arrival of a number of Eastern Europeans, the Aliens Act, as I said, in 1905. In London, there were 29 different Jewish tailoring trade unions during that period. In Leeds, just the one, the AGTMP. Why was it successful? My argument is it was leadership. Its first general secretary was Sam Friedman, who arrived from Kovno in 1883. He was a tailor's machiner, he was a young socialist, and he was appointed general secretary in 1895. But he followed a moderate path, a working relationship with the City Trades Council and the equivalent, the English Amalgamated Union of Clothing Workers Union. Friedman attended all the meetings of the Trade Union Congress in spite of its anti-alien stance. And really, Sam Friedman was holding the union together, gaining respect. Everything was going really well. But then it was discovered that there was a problem with the funds in the union and that Sam had actually borrowed money from union funds. And really, very tragically, in 1905, he fled to New York. The authorities and the union leaders wanted to take action, and they told his wife that if she would repay his debt, they wouldn't take action against him. He returned to Leeds in 1907 and opened a small business. And there, as far as my story with him goes, I know no more. He was followed by Moses Sclair, that some of you may know. He's a completely different character. He was a trained engineer, he was born in Ukraine, and he migrated to Scotland, where he settled in 1889 and became secretary and president of his branch of the Amalgamated Society of Engineers. So he had a grounding in English trade unionism. He was a dedicated socialist, not of the violent kind. He met Keir Hardie, he met Prince Kropotkin, he met Stepnayak. He was fluent in Russian, Yiddish, and English. He was an advocate of labor and socialist politics, and he put the union, the AGJTMP, back on course. And by 1907, membership had risen to 900. And it's also impressive, and I know I keep pushing this forward, but I think it's so important, particularly when you compare it to London, that he and the General Secretary and leader of the English Clothing Workers Union, the two of them visited workshops and factories together to encourage trade union membership. So you have, if you like, a gradual coming together of the two leading clothing workers unions in Leeds, who are to become the two leaders of the new national union. In 1908, there was a strike to abolish piecework, but agreement was found with the masters that led to some of them moving to smaller premises because they couldn't afford to pay the workers what they wanted, and they dismissed some of the workers. And Sclair realized that this was not the way. In 1911, the union opened its own labor hall, and I've got an image of this. But then the Jewish tailors called a strike which covered 56 workshops, 705 men and 402 women. It was approaching the busy season. But the Leeds Jewish Master Tailors Association and Sclair agreed to arbitration. An award was made to ameliorate wages, hours, and conditions. Again, the losers here were the employers. A number went bankrupt, and some had to close their workshops, and 300 workers were made redundant. The fault lay neither with the employers nor the workers, but the system, which saw the rates of pay from the wholesalers so low that it forced the employers, the masters, to lower their payments, and then this went down the chain of production. I found no more evidence of strikes in Leeds before the 1915 amalgamation. Leadership or fear of loss of income, one or the other, but by 1915, the Leeds Jewish Tailoring Union had come of age, as opposed to all of its London counterparts. And just very briefly, because I haven't got time, and I did want to show you just things that you might want to refresh your memory with. In London, there were a multiplicity of Jewish unions. There were poor leaders. One of the names that stands out was a guy called Lewis Lyons, who ended up leading 9 unions inefficiently. And the one union that, if you like, survived and stood supreme was the United Ladies Tailors Union. One of my children actually asked me when I was doing this, do you mean that it was a ladies' trade union? And I said, no, they were making ladies' garments. That stood alone till 1939, when it became part of the National Union. So in a way, I think Leeds stands out as an example of the way in which the union survived with good leadership, the way in which they recognized the sensibility of interacting with their English counterparts, and at times with gradually learning the kind of need to understand when strike action would produce results and when it wouldn't. Now, Jonathan, have I got time to show my brief PowerPoint?
Of course, please do.
This is really going over what I said. Let me just share screen. I'm not going to do it full screen because I said, Jonathan, previously that my computer have a habit of freezing if I do the whole screen. This is just going over what I said in case some of you want to, if you like, write down the names. These are the actors. We had John Barron, the manufacturer, Herman Friend, the workshop master, Moishe Goodman, who became the workshop master but recruited immigrants to come and work in the trade, Joseph Fim, member of the Socialist League, machiner, writer, James Sweeney, Tom Paler and Tom Maguire, also members of the Socialist League, and James Sweeney, one-time secretary of the Jewish Tailors Union. So, you know, how's that? You've got this guy, not Jewish, and he's secretary of the Jewish Tailors Union. And you've got Sam Friedman, general secretary of the Amalgamated Jewish Tailors, Machiners and Pressers between 1895 and 1905. And then Moses Sclair, who becomes general secretary after him till 1915, when he becomes financial secretary of the Amalgamated Union. You've also got workshop employees who became master tailors and manufacturers, David Lubelski, Jacob Fraze, Solomon Kamras, to name just a few. These were the ones that actually, when I did my research, particularly in the Yorkshire Factory Times, which some of you may have heard of and some of you not, these are names that I found. Now, these are the trade unions in Leeds: Jewish Working Tailors Trade Society, 1876, 1883, 1888, 3 separate Jewish unions, tailors, machiners and pressers. They then all joined the Gas Workers and General Labourers Union. In 1893, the Amalgamated Jewish Tailors, Machiners and Pressers Union is founded. And in 1915, that becomes part of the newly created Amalgamated Union of Clothing Operatives. That then becomes, by the 1920s, the Tailor and Garment Workers Union. It subsequently becomes Tailor and Garment Workers, and I can't remember which, early in the 1990s, it became part of the GMB. So an independent clothing union no longer exists. And they're still trying to recruit immigrant workers, because I remember when I was working in the head office of the National Union of Tailor and Garment Workers, they were complaining that they couldn't get any Cypriot tailors or those employed in their workshops to join the union. Strikes, 1884, 1885, 88, 1908, 1911. Very few photographs. This is Joseph Finn, and his picture was given to me actually by his daughter, who I interviewed a long time ago. And that's the only, oh no, I have got another image for you, I think. That's Joseph Finn. This is the Jewish Trade Union Institute. This is that they managed, with donations from wholesalers, from workers, from everybody, to open their sort of labour hall. And this image came from the collection of a guy called Henry Rollin, who himself was a trade union leader. That name may mean something to somebody. And finally, the officers of the tailors and garment workers. And that's the one picture I found of Moses Clare. And that's Annie McLaughlin, who became the first woman General Secretary of a trade union. That's Joseph Young, who until the amalgamation in 1915 led the Amalgamated Union of Clothing Operatives. And you'll have to forgive me because I can't remember that guy's name. Now, if anybody is desperate to look at this, if you'll let Jonathan know, I can send off the PowerPoint. I do some lectures down here, and people are desperate for the PowerPoint. This is just a very brief one. Okay, Jonathan, I'll stop the share. And there we are.
Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us in such incredible detail. And if you have questions for Anne, please post them in the Q&A now, and we will do our best to get through them. So as soon as you started talking about John Barron and Herman Friend, I grabbed my copy of Leeds and its Jewish Community off the bookshelf, because I knew there was a question in my mind. And I realise now that you actually wrote the chapter.
I wrote the chapter.
Which I didn't know until I just flicked through it now. But as you say, John Barron is accredited with having invented the use of the bandsaw for cloth.
Knife.
The band knife. Sorry, I beg your pardon. But in the same book, in the chapter by Michael Meadowcroft, he implies that it was actually Herman Friend who developed the technology. So I just wondered whether you had any specific evidence to support the claim. I suspect you're right.
I'm pretty sure I'm right, because I did, this was my thesis from which the book was developed. I'm looking it up now to see if I can find the references, but that was the whole point, because another aspect, which, if I may say, is that cutting is one of the most skilled operations. And there was a wonderful trade unionist called Mick Mindle, who I worked with, who led the United Ladies Tailors Union, and he died some years ago. And a lot of cutters were trained in Germany, because your average Eastern European tailor was not a skilled cutter, and therefore it would have taken a skill to cut these. And the band knife was what led Barron to expand his business. And I'm pretty sure I'm right.
I had heard
I did the research.
yeah.
I did do the research in great detail, and I'm pretty sure I'm right.
He'd observed the use of the knife to cut veneers of wood and wondered whether...
That's right. He got someone to then make a band knife that could cut cloth with.
And there's another claim by Meadowcroft in the book that Baron wouldn't employ Jews in his factory.
Yeah, I think that is possible.
That's correct.
I think that's possible, yes. I don't like using the term anti-Semitism because I relate that to its emergence in 1873, when a German journalist coined it to use the term Jew hatred. I use anti-Jewishness, but he may have had I don't know what his reason was. He obviously wasn't anti-Jewish, otherwise he wouldn't have cooperated with Friend and used the workshops. And maybe he felt that another thing was, and he wouldn't employ them. And bear in mind that, I've just seen something come up, bear in mind that a lot of the people we're talking about in the workshops would not speak or understand English. And when they were working in a tailoring workshop run by a Jewish master, the language was most likely Yiddish, not English. Now, whether that was one of the reasons or whether he felt that they weren't reliable, but I would have thought that language was also a subject.
Yes, that's a very good point. Now, Malcolm Sender asks about the difference between hand tailoring and machine tailoring. It sounds very obvious, but I'm sure it isn't.
Well, are we talking about bespoke tailoring, which were the tailors that wouldn't do, I mean, you know, everything sewn by hand very carefully. And I'm not quite sure that even the bespoke tailors didn't use a sewing machine or something, but it's a much more skilled element. The subdivisional workshops in both Leeds and London really were far less skilled. And at one time, and I think this possibly predates Montague Burton, tailoring shops in London would actually get the clothes, they'd send the measurements and they would be made up in Leeds and then sent back to London. But hand tailoring was skilled. Machine tailoring required a skill because the machiner was the most skilled member of the workshop.
But as you say, the process of hand tailoring may well have involved an element of machine.
Oh, tremendous skill. And that's why Baron had to turn to the Jewish workshops.
Now we have a question from Anne and Michael Crook. It sounds as though the immigrants from Russia brought socialism with them rather than it being homegrown. Is this correct?
No, I mean, Kropotkin was a socialist, Stepnayak was a socialist, but the people we're talking about, the Social Democratic Federation, which was founded by Henry Hindman, who tended to upset everyone, and that concept was basically they didn't bring it with them necessarily. No, people like Kropotkin did, and you'd had Karl Marx earlier, but the Socialist League and the Social Democratic Federation were homegrown. Although Eleanor Marx became a member of the Socialist League, but of course, as I say, William Morris was one of the main leaders, and that was very much homegrown. There were influences, and we later see Kropotkin's coming slightly later, you know, that might have been fed in, but the Socialist League is dead by 1901. And we then see the emergence of the Labour Representation Committee, which will then become the Labour Party.
So a couple of questions about the migration of workers to Leeds. Helen Fraser asks, about the extent to which the pogroms in the Haim contributed to the migration to Leeds. And also an interesting question from Anne Bennett about modern day slavery relying on the threat of hurting family left at home. How much of the movement of people to Leeds and their ongoing subjugation relied on similar threats?
Take the first one first. Sorry, remind me, what was the first one?
The impact of the pogroms
Right,
on
okay.
migration.
Right, okay. There was a brilliant Russian Jewish history historian called John Clear, who sadly died much too young, about 15 years ago. And he always said, and I agree, that although the pogroms played a part, the main motivation was economic achievement. There was such poverty and such lack of opportunity that was the main reason for migration. The pogroms, yes, they were a factor, we can't deny that, but it was economic advantage, economic opportunity. They were basically economic migrants, though some would have been escaping the pogroms, which were, ad hoc. They were economic migrants. And John, if anybody wants to look him up, his work was excellent, and we lost him much too soon. In terms of threats back home, no, it wasn't that sophisticated. We're talking about people traffickers in a completely different kind of world. The only people that were trafficked, and this is getting away from the tailoring trade, were young women who were trafficked as prostitutes from Eastern Europe, and very often to the brothels of South America. And yes, they were duped. And I'm going right away from tailoring, but they were duped very often by these men that would go over to Eastern Europe and persuade these women that they were going to marry them, or they did marry them. Of course, it wasn't a true marriage. And then the girls ended up in brothels. And some mothers, even in Eastern Europe, would actually encourage their daughters to go and become prostitutes and run the brothels. And Jewish women were very popular in Buenos Aires, and there were very many Jewish brothel owners. And that's nothing to do with the tailoring trade.
No, and I'm sure not a widely known piece of information.
Well, no, there has been a book on it, actually. I think it was Eric Bristow. I know there was a darts player. And to answer, no, the kind of threats that we see from people traffickers today, it's too sophisticated. Although there was a sort of a method of communication, it wouldn't have been in that way at all. And it was young men and then the young men would save enough money to pay very often for their fiancés or their wives to join them.
Thank you. Charles Corman wants to know about the attitude of the trade unions to the prominent manufacturers like Montagu Burton.
Montagu Burton, and again, this is going beyond, Montagu Burton, by 1915, he had got a big factory and he treated his workers very well. So I don't know that there was any bad feeling, because you get the bad feeling, and you're talking about, I looked at wartime when you did have strikes, actually, and I didn't come across any great antipathy to Burton. He ran an exemplary factory, if you think about it, at the time. And so did Barron. Barron was very concerned about the quality of life of his workers as well. And he ran, when he moved in his new factory, he looked after the welfare, because common sense told these people, if you look after your workers, you get better work.
And Barron's factories, some of them at least, are still standing and are repurposed in this city for other commercial activities. Barbara Levy asks, can you explain why David Lebelsky was foremost as a master tailor? He was foremost a master tailor who supported his workers. Why did he stand out?
Because not many of the others did. He was actually, he stood up and he supported the way. He became a wholesale manufacturer. And he was actually heavily criticized and sort of asked to leave the Master Tailors Association because he'd supported the workers, because he was a compassionate man and a very good man. And I don't know whether there's anybody listening I can't see anybody but listening who knows any more about him. He died in 1912, and as I don't know if I said it while I was talking to you all, but I read his obituary, and sitting there in, oh gosh, it was now the 1980s or early 90s. I mean, I cried because you become very attached, and he was yes, he stood out.
Well, thank you so much for taking our questions. There's lots of other comments in the chat and in the Q&A that you might have a look at, but we'll certainly get them forwarded onto you, so people's messages will get through. We have a couple of gifts for you for being our guests. So firstly, this publication, Three Giants of Leeds, Three Jewish Giants of Leeds. This is a more of a pamphlet, but it covers Professor Selig Brodetsky, Sir Montague Burton, who we've just spoken about, and Jacob Kramer, the artist.
Can I tell you a very quick story about Burton's? Because
please do.
I was in 1988, I was the curator of the London Museum of Jewish Life, which is now the Jewish Museum, and at that time we were housed in an attic in the Sternberg Centre in Finchley, and I had written a little monograph. I hadn't published the book. And we had a tailoring workshop there, and people would come in, and a man came into my office one day, a very nice man. He said, oh, you know, I've really enjoyed coming round, although it's a small area. He said, my father had a factory in Leeds. And I said, well, there were loads of factories in Leeds. I said, what was your father's name? He said, Burton, Montague Burton. And you can imagine I had egg all over my face. But the result was that Raymond Burton ensured, he gave £1 million to enable the Jewish Museum from its attic to go to its wonderful location in Camden. So that's my Burton story.
What an amazing story, and what an amazing,
I felt so embarrassed.
amazing location as well for the museum. It's a fabulous building. The other thing I'm sending you is some of my photography. This is Magen David Adom in action around Israel. So hopefully
lovely.
you'll
Thank you
enjoy
very
that.
much. Well, you've got my address, which is
a
long way from Leeds.
Well, I'm sure the postman doesn't mind, and
my postman's used to it. Yes.
Quickly.
Yes.
Now, let me just tell you about some of our up and coming events. Just a couple for now. Next Monday, the 16th of August, we have Tony Zendel. He's speaking about the golden age of dance bands and the many Jewish connections he has discovered in his book Kosher Foxtrot. Some fascinating insights in that book, so we're looking forward to having him on. And then finally, for now, on the 23rd of August, Meriel Schindler will be telling us about her book The Lost Cafe Schindler, a family memoir centered on one of Innsbruck's most famous institutions. Our program continues into September and beyond, so please do visit our website at milim.org.uk to sign up for our regular bulletins and make sure you don't miss anything. All our events are free, but you can make a small donation on our website to help support the cost of our work and providing these webinars. It remains for me to thank our guest, Anne Kershen, once again. Thank you so much, Anne, for being our guest this evening.
And if anybody wants to know more, I did publish a book called Uniting the Tailors. Whether it's still available, I don't know, but it tells a lot more of the story.
And I'm looking forward to seeing you all at a future event. And until then, stay safe. See you soon.
Thank you.